Who is Dr. Eidelson? He was on our show before when he released his great book. Dr. Roy Eidelson is a psychologist and the author of the book Political Mind Games: How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. I have a link directly to that book in the blog. Please do go ahead and get that book, if you will, because you would learn quite a bit. He discussed that in detail in a previous presence that he had here at Politics Done Right. The former executive director of the University of Pennsylvania Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict, a past president of Psychologists for Social Responsibility, and a member of the Coalition for an Ethical Psychology. In his current work, Roy focuses on applying psychological knowledge to issues of social justice and political change. His writing has appeared in a variety of scholarly journals and other outlets, including the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times. You can follow him online at www.royeidelson.com. Eidelson is spelled E-I-D-E-L-S-O-N. So it's ROYEIDELSON.com. You can follow him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Roy Eidelson, ROYEIDELSON. Dr. Eidelson, are you there? Are you there?
Yes.
What happened?
Can you hear me?
Could you hear me all while I was trying to talk to you?
I could hear you the whole time. Yes.
Wow. That is
a little bit frustrating, but I switched to my cell phone.
Yeah, that is so interesting that occurred. Anyhow, I hope you heard all the stuff that I spoke about, how we got to you, etc.
Yes.
Great. Excellent.
I heard it all. I guess some people don't want us to be in touch with each other.
I guess that's what it is, because it's interesting, because we were speaking right before we got on air and suddenly something happened with your line. But anyhow, here's the thing. I love what you wrote. I love that it sort of drew in some of the things that we discussed previously with your book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this article that you wrote, starting with what the reason that you gave it, the title that you gave it.
Sure. Well, for a while now, I've been, as a psychologist, I've been focused on kind of how is it that the rich and powerful are, in the United States, pretty much specifically, are able to maintain their wealth and influence seemingly so easily at times. And my research has led me to conclude that they do it through certain manipulative psychological appeals, certain what I call mind games that tap into a set of core concerns we have. And when we hear these arguments, they have the ring of truth, and we believe them, even though they lack any real foundation or credibility. I've noticed this applies kind of broadly in terms of how the so-called 1%, the self-interested 1%, I'll narrow it down in that way, advance their agenda, whether it be in regard to domestic policy or national security. They often do it by raising issues of, and I'll name 5 of them: vulnerability, are we safe? Injustice, are we being treated fairly? Distrust, who can we trust? Superiority, are we good enough? And helplessness, can we control what happens to us? And my research looking at this, studying it carefully, has led me to identify 20 mind games, 4 in each of these areas. And as I've been watching the proceedings unfold regarding Judge Kavanaugh and his nomination to the Supreme Court, I was increasingly struck by how these very same mind games are being used to manipulate us in terms of how we're supposed to understand what is unfolding today. Right now, with the very credible accusations of sexual assault against him, and how basically the president and the key senators in the GOP are trying to twist our understanding in a way that works to the advantage of pushing that nomination forward.
I love the way that what you said. I mean, it's one of the points that you spoke about. I don't remember if it fell into the point that you called. I think you had there's vulnerability, injustice, distrust, superiority, and helplessness. I think you put it in helplessness, where you pointed out that in as much as we have all of this going on, where there's going to be hearings, where other people are coming out to substantiate what this man purportedly has done, you came out and you said the privileged, the 1%, have this thing that they use against the common person, that thing called helplessness, where Mitch McConnell just comes out and says, we're going to just bull this thing right through.
Exactly. There's nothing more potent in a negative way than our feeling helpless. Feeling helpless basically will sink any endeavor that we undertake. If we don't think we can control the outcomes in our lives, we give up. And what he has done, McConnell, and he's not the only one, but remarkably, given all the uncertainty surrounding this nomination, including the likely testimony on Thursday from Dr. Ford and from Judge Kavanaugh, Majority Leader McConnell still has the chutzpah to tell a meeting of supporters that they need not worry, that in the very near future, Judge Kavanaugh will be on the United States Supreme Court. Don't get rattled by all of this, he said. We're going to plow right through it. And that's a message that fits into the mind game I describe as resistance is futile. If we're persuaded that we cannot effectively resist, it makes it so much easier for the 1%.
You know, Dr. Eidelson, that is what really touched me. And the reason the helplessness portion touched me so much is, as a political activist trying to get people out to vote in the 2018 elections, exactly as you stated, a lot of folks, what they come back with is, why go vote? It doesn't matter anyway. They're going to do what they're going to do. And that falls exactly into what you're saying, that is a powerful feeling, that's a powerful thing that allows them to keep power. They make you believe that they're so powerful that you cannot do anything about it. So then why disrupt your life? Why go ahead and put and pay somebody to hold your kids while you go vote? Why leave work early and make that extra turn to go vote if it doesn't matter anyway? Is that pretty much, am I reading what you're talking about right?
Right. I agree with you. We make it in this country far more difficult to vote than other countries. It's not a national holiday. And in other ways, some people want it to be difficult for people to vote. And that typically is those who already have wealth and power and want to maintain the status quo. But I would add to what you're saying, I agree, but part of the problem, part of what also can make people feel helpless is the sense, rightly or wrongly, that there isn't that much difference between the candidates they can choose between. Often there is a difference, but too often the difference isn't big enough. I mean, if we don't, those who would most distinguish themselves as progressive candidates, for example, most distinguish themselves from the mainstream, from the status quo, who would bring us the kind of changes we need, whether it be Medicare for all or higher minimum wage or tackling climate change seriously. They have a very hard time becoming a major party candidate, too hard a time. And some people, some prospective voters decide there's not enough of a difference between these two candidates. I'm not going to make a choice. I think I read, and it was kind of striking to me, just earlier this week, maybe, or last week, that there was a poll of voters or potential voters who chose to sit out the 2016 election, presidential election.
Right.
And they were asked, what would they do if they could do it over again? And what's striking is that, as I recall, over half of them said, again, they would not vote.
That is amazing.
So, yeah, even what we have seen in the past year and a half, not enough to get everyone, out there and voting. They still would have decided between those two candidates, they're going to sit it out. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying it would be interesting and encouraging if there were bigger differences between the candidates that we choose between.
Well, that is what we need, and I tell you, that is what we are fighting for right now. That's why we have programs like Politics Done Right, and that's why we are out there in the field, and that's why we're at Netroots Nation, and that's what we're doing. The progressives are starting to, again, try to assert themselves. The biggest problem is staying power. Now, let's go back to your article, however. I mean, I like the way, again, vulnerability, injustice, distrust, superiority, and helplessness. Let's talk a little bit about vulnerability, because that was an interesting. You made that the first thing on your piece, trying to show what they do to sort of dismiss exactly something that could actually be very serious, but they're using that as a tactic to for people to sort of take their eye off the ball. Why don't you give us a little bit more expansion on that?
Sure. I often talk about vulnerability first because I think it typically matters most to us, whether or not we feel safe, whether we think there's danger on the horizon, has a tremendous impact on decisions we make, actions we take, so on. And in the case of the Kavanaugh situation, what the GOP senators are doing, in my view, is using the "it's a false alarm" mind game. Mm-hmm. Kind of the specific intent is to reassure people that things are not as serious or concerning as others are making them out to be. Specifically, in regard to Judge Kavanaugh, what they're trying to say is, even if it's true, even if what has been described by Dr. Ford as happening when they were both teenagers, is it really such a big deal? Is what they ask. One GOP operative on CNN said, what boy hasn't done this in high school? Kind of dismissively. Another, evangelist Franklin Graham claimed that even if it's true, no crime was committed. So this is it's a false alarm mind game saying, some people are making a big deal out of it, but the sky isn't falling here. And it's a microcosm of what the 1% do writ large in society. And in some ways, the best example is climate change. Right. Because the ravages are clear. There's no question. There's scientific consensus. You can't get greater consensus on a profoundly important issue than we already have on climate change. But because 1%ers either are responding to wealthy donors or the oil and gas industry or
I think we lost you again, Dr. Eidelson. If you may want to call back in again, because you just
there's not enough evidence.
Yeah, go ahead. You're back.
So it's the same situation that we have. Climate change is a disaster, and yet those who benefit from the status quo are trying to reassure us, and at the extreme, deny it. And in the Kavanaugh situation, again, the GOP, the Trump administration are trying to reassure us, these stories, these events, they don't matter. Right. Let's not let them distract us.
That is amazing. Now, before we continue, I want this. I'm speaking to Dr. Roy Eidelson, psychologist and author of Political Mind Games. He wrote an excellent article yesterday, and I wanted to talk to him about it, and he's given us a rundown completely on it. I also want to do a shout out to Sapphire Sky, who asked for us to please go to the link, enter GGWCUP and vote for climate reality now. I thought it was a good segue since, Doctor, you're talking about climate right now. And that
absolutely.
Yeah, that link is at https app2.sli.do/event/AFP0XQ0R/polls. Just go ahead, folks, and go to the show and click on the link. She has it right there, Sapphire Sky. I hope it works out for you. Okay, Dr. Eidelson, the second item you brought up was injustice, and I love that because it is sort of like, oh my God, I am rich, I am loaded, and I have done all these things, but why do you hate me, or why are you treating me so badly? Why don't you go on that one?
That's right. That's we're the victims mind game, where one percenters try and kind of turn the tables on us in regard to our thinking, and they present themselves not as perpetrators of an extraordinarily unequal society,
right.
Not the cause of that, but in fact somehow victims because because people pick on them, because people complain, because people are upset with billionaire tax cuts, and somehow we lose sight of the fact that they've worked so hard to earn their billions of dollars. It's that kind of sentiment and message that we see, in regard to economic issues in general, when those who have more than everyone else want to defend how that has come about and why it should stay the same way. And it's clearly a part of the Kavanaugh proceedings in regard to how various senators are expressing, tremendous upset at, what this is doing to Judge Kavanaugh's life. The horror of being accused of something like this.
Without even thinking about the
case that being.
Without thinking about the horror.
What's that?
Without thinking about the horror that these women likely went through psychologically, that is.
Exactly. It's the women who have been assaulted are the victims here. It's not those who have been the perpetrators, and that one can say that in so many situations. I mean, it's more and more obvious, and it doesn't require. In this case, the accusations are certainly credible, so one doesn't even have to be sure. There's every reason in this case to believe Dr. Ford, and yet the GOP is coming out with messaging focused on how awful it is for Judge Kavanaugh to have to go through this.
Now, that injustice piece fits this so perfectly. Now, let me ask you something. This is sort of a little segue before I go to the third item here. And what is it within some folks that have no reason to support? Let's say I always talk about the 10% being the guardians of the gates for the real folks that are rich in this country, meaning that for some reason there are these people that are there to defend those who really don't care anything about them, but they're always defending them. And we can go to Appalachia as well and can see how many of those people would defend people that really don't give a rat's about them, if you understand what I'm saying. What's the pathology there?
Mm-hmm. Well, in part, people who are struggling are looking for change. And if they think someone is going to bring that about, if they've grown disappointed with the current situation, they're going to look for a savior, so to speak. And they'll make mistakes. Not always. Sometimes such people who can kind of help move us forward in a positive way come about. But if you're struggling and you know the current situation has not worked out for you and the current leaders haven't, then there's the risk that you're going to end up siding with those who are able to present themselves as concerned about your welfare, even though they're not. So I think that's part of what goes on. I'm not sure if that's a direct answer.
No, actually,
to your question.
Yeah, I think it does. That because again, you wonder why they're not in the same socioeconomic field. They're not in any of these things. But somebody like Trump did come out and say, "I am going to make lives better for you." You've always seen Democrats. You've always seen Republicans. I'm neither. So some did take a chance on that, I guess, above and beyond the other issues that we know about. Now, you also talk about distrust. Why don't you explain the distrust portion?
Sure. In general, well, distrust is one of the 5 core concerns I think we have.
Yes.
And we tend to divide people or groups into those we think are trustworthy and those we think are not. And it really matters a lot where we draw that line. One of the mind games that the 1% use to tell us, don't believe them, don't believe low-wage workers who are saying the conditions in their factories are awful. Don't believe prison reformers who are agitating about for-profit prisons. Don't believe anti-war activists. The message that's often used from the 1%, the mind game, is they're devious and dishonest. So they will try and discredit those who are trying to change things, either for the better for themselves or for others as well. That if we are told that what they're saying isn't true, that they're untrustworthy, that they're deceitful, then unfortunately, even though they may be entirely honest in what they're saying and what they're trying to accomplish, we don't believe them. And if we don't believe those who are suffering and disadvantaged, we're less likely to have compassion for them. We're less likely to build solidarity with them. In the same way, in the Kavanaugh microcosm, what the GOP is trying to do is paint this as a situation where all kinds of manipulation and deceit is going on, and that's what Dr. Ford is about. That's what some of the others who have alleged sexual assault are about. And there's no basis. They have no evidence to support. The 1% have no evidence to support their claims. But it can work anyway. The problem with these 5 core concerns and the mind games associated with them is that often they have the ring of truth, even if there's nothing behind them.
Plausibility.
And it's kind of interesting that I was going to say, just earlier today, President Trump at the UN was asked about, I guess after his speech, was asked about the Kavanaugh situation, and he described the Democrats. He said they're really con artists. They don't believe it themselves. They're playing a con game, and they play it very well. And the truth is, in this case, he's got it exactly right that there are con artists at work, but he's misidentified them. It's actually, the White House and the Republican senators behind this.
Interesting. Now, what about superiority? How you actually map that as well to the Kavanaugh case?
Yeah, the mind game, superior mind game that I think fits best there is what I call pursuing a higher purpose. And we see this more broadly whenever the government or powerful forces or corporate America pursues an agenda that includes some really awful things, but they will say, okay, even if that happened, you got to consider the context, and you got to realize that we are trying to achieve something really wonderful. And if there's going to be some that lose out along the way, there's nothing we can do about that. The most striking example to me, based on other work I've done, is the way the pursuing a higher purpose mind game was used to defend the torture of prisoners at Guantanamo and CIA black sites. Suddenly, after thousands of years of general agreement that torture is wrong and immoral and awful, and it also happens to be ineffective, we have to give torturers a pass because they're trying to keep us safe. It's that kind of, in that case, the higher purpose is national security, and some awful things may happen, but let's not, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And when it comes to the Kavanaugh scenario, you have kind of GOP operatives insisting that regardless of what happened, this is a great man, and we shouldn't let, what happened years ago get in the way of his rising to the position that will create such value for the American people. That's probably not what the broad American people are going to get if Kavanaugh becomes part of the Supreme Court, but that's the claim, that these small things, and they're presented as small things like sexual assault as a teenager, need to be discounted because this is someone very special. This is an exceptional person.
Folks, the title of the piece is called Political Mind Games, The Kavanaugh File. It's a must-read. Dr. Eidelson went over some of the basic concepts within that article, but I think it's something that everyone needs to read, because I think it's a very Dr. Eidelson, what I thought when I read the article, just this morning when I pulled it up and read it, it was sort of enlightening, enlightening and empowering, because a lot of these techniques that kind of go under the radar, you get to see them as expressed from a psychologist who analyzes this and analyzes the psyche of many. So I really appreciated the article. So folks, you can go to royeidelson.com to his blog, and you can find all the other articles that he's written. And don't forget to check out his book as well. The name of his book is Political Mind Games: How the 1% Manipulate Our Understanding of What's Happening, What's Right, and What's Possible. Before we close, Dr. Eidelson, I want to ask you, what's your thoughts on the current November 6th elections?
Well, I'm not much of a prognosticator. I know they're really important, and the more people that vote, the better the outcome is likely to be. There's some wonderful candidates. There's some wonderful, in this case, Democrats running in various places, and regaining control of the House of Representatives would certainly be an important bulwark against the continuing destruction that the White House and the Republicans have wrought, and taking back the Senate, if that can happen too, even better. And again, I'll just reiterate the progressive candidates. We need them to lead us forward.
Absolutely. So anything you want to add real quickly before we go, sir?
I think that's it. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas. I do think that, recognizing these mind games, as a psychologist, I can say I think it's the first step in being able to counter them. They kind of, they're like the water we swim in or the air we breathe. That's how prevalent they are, and that's how easily the 1% have vehicles for promoting them. So we gotta be alert and vigilant, and if we can counter them, they'll lose their effectiveness, and that's the key.
Excellent. Dr. Roy Eidelson, psychologist and author of Political Mind Games. Thank you so kindly for having been with us, sir.
Thanks very much.